Welcome, everyone, to the sixth event in our 2013-14 season of the Provost Forums on the Public Good. Can you hear? No, it needs to be louder. We'll try that again. On the public university and the common good, the social good, I should say. This afternoon, we're privileged to have as our featured speakers Professor David Marshall, the Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts at UC Santa Barbara, and Professor William Ladusaw, Humanities Dean at UC Santa Cruz. Deans Marshall and Ladusaw will each speak on the topic, the humanities and the common good, after which there'll be a panel discussion and audience participation. In just a few moments, Dean Jessie Ann Owens of our own Division of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies in the College of Letters and Science will give our speakers in a program a proper introduction. So I'll keep my own introductory remarks briefer than even usual. Today's forum, which connects the humanities with the question of what a university should be, is not merely a parochial enterprise or a first step into wholly new territory. The proper role of the humanities in the academy and in society has been a topic of learned and often passionate discussion for a very long time. We'll delve more deeply into the history in our program proper, but I'd like to use some of my time just to whet your appetite. Today I'm not primarily interested in that distant era in which the humanities were securely situated at the center of a university education. I direct your attention, rather, to the last century and a half or so, in which a number of eminent figures have, at least implicitly, sounded the alarm that the humanities are undervalued and at risk within the academy and beyond. I'm speaking, for example, of the Victorian poet and Oxford professor Matthew Arnold, who criticized the segment of the population he called Philistines. In his word, the people who believe most that our greatness and welfare are proved by our being very rich, and who most give their lives and thoughts to becoming rich. Against this Philistine disposition and the industrial environment in which it flourished, Arnold, as you all know, advocated culture, which he defined in part as the moral and social passion for doing good. Culture also embraces beauty along with thought, or to use his famous phrase, sweetness and light. I think of Arnold's fellow Oxonian, John Henry Newman, who similarly argued that a university education should not serve utilitarian ends, but rather instill a philosophical habit of mind comprising freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. A university, he said in another famous phrase, properly fostered the pursuit of knowledge as its own end. Excuse me. For my 20th century example, I'll cite a Cambridge figure, the late philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who warned against the mistake of thinking that a university has any function at all. For him, the university was a manner of human activity tied to a geographical place. In this place, diverse disciplines and persons came together in intellectual conversation, and faculty and students merely followed the intellectual paths that they found most inviting. What they didn't do was think about the practical ends of their academic journeys. And finally, to give a much more recent example, the 2013 Brandeis University commencement address given by Leon Wieseltier, a literary editor of The New Republic. In his address, which achieved a modest level of internet virality, Wieseltier makes a memorably strong and blunt case for the humanities, along with a fierce indictment of the current state of higher education and society. He says in part, and I quote, "For decades now in America, we have been witnessing a steady and sickening denigration of humanistic understanding and humanistic method. We live in a society inebriated by technology and happily, even giddily governed by the values of utility, speed, efficiency, and convenience," end quote. So I can imagine that quotation alone providing ample material for today's forum, but of course we have so much more. I've invoked a few ideas of the last century and a half, not only to provide some context for the presentations to come, but also because doing so allows me to make a couple of prefatory points. First, I believe that our collective contemplation of historical utterances on the relationship between the humanities and the university can help us to see present circumstances and future possibilities with greater clarity. Second, I think that hearing the voices of Arnold, Newman, Oakeshott, and Wieseltier remind us, in the face of so many contemporary opinions to the contrary, that believing in the profound social value of the humanities is a wholly legitimate and rational position, not one that needs to be declared timidly or with apology. I'm grateful that today's speakers and all of you in the audience will be contributing to this crucial dialogue with new ideas, observations, and questions. I personally cannot remember any time in which the humanities seem more undervalued, more at risk, more in need of our support. Before I leave the subject of today's program, let me remind you that all of you are invited to continue discussion of the humanities and the common good during the reception right outside, immediately following our panel discussion. Now, a quick look ahead. Today's Provost Forum will be followed by 3 more yet this academic year. Details are available on my website and flyers are forthcoming. I will just tantalize you with the topics. Our next forum on Tuesday, April 22nd, will focus on the topic Universities and Regional Change. On Wednesday, May 7th, will be diversity in the university. And on Monday, June 2nd, we'll finish our season with something of a departure, but one that I think you'll agree justifies itself. 6 of our UC Davis undergraduates will present the findings of their honors research projects into the ideas and concerns of their fellow UC Davis students concerning the public university and the social good. I hope that all of you will be able to attend one or more of those upcoming events. If you do miss one, videos of all events along with other materials are available on my website. So before concluding this part of my contribution, I want to thank the Provost Forum's organizing committee for their ongoing efforts and expertise in planning and arranging events both this year and last. The 2 campus entities that have joined my office to co-sponsor this event, the Division of Arts, Humanities, and Cultural Studies in the College of Letters and Science, the Community and Regional Development Program. Our moderator, Jessie Ann Owens, who besides being Dean of the Division, is also a professor in our Department of Music. My 2 eminent colleagues who will join me in today's panel, Margaret Ferguson, a distinguished professor of English at UC Davis and concurrently president of the Modern Language Association, and and Reynolds, professor of music and president of the American Musicological Society. And last but not least, a great thanks to Deans Marshall and Ladusaw for traveling to our campus and speaking with us today. So I now turn the podium over to Dean Owens.
Thanks, Ralph. A very eloquent introduction to the afternoon's proceedings. I'm going to be very brief in introducing our speakers. I am very, very pleased that they have come to participate in this important topic. So first, David Marshall is a tireless advocate for the humanities, Dean and Professor of English and Comp Lit at University of California at Santa Barbara since 1998. That weighs in at 16 years, some sort of a record. He is currently president of the National Humanities Alliance, which is a national advocacy coalition for the humanities, and he's the chair of the Humanities Advisory Council of the University of California. This is a group that consists of humanities deans who advise the president, the system president, on matters having to do with the humanities. And I have to say that he's been a prime force behind the Humanities Initiative and more recently the Humanities Network, and has worked incredibly hard to secure ongoing funding for the humanities centers and humanities enterprises such as UCHRI. Without him, our lives would be much poorer. Bill Ladusaw joined the Faculty of Linguistics at UC Santa Cruz in 1984, served as Vice Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Education, and since 2010 as Dean of Humanities. He's been a powerful advocate for humanities at Santa Cruz, and I will confess to a severe case of building envy at what he has been able to do with his remarkable humanities center. He's very active with WASC, our accrediting agency, and really cares about how we represent our work to various constituencies, and in particular the various publics that we serve. Margie Ferguson is Distinguished Professor of English. She's been at UC Davis since 1997 and is now president of the Modern Language Association. I cut my eye teeth on being dean when Margie was chair of English, and together we made, I think it was 11 hires. And I have to describe her as a thought partner for my entire time as dean. She's been director of the Mellon Research Initiative in Early Modern Studies. Her 2003 book, Dido's Daughters, received awards from 4 disciplinary societies, which surely has to be some sort of a record. Chris Reynolds is the winner of the 2013 UC Davis Prize for Undergraduate Teaching and Scholarly Achievement. By the way, that's a $40,000 award, and it is a big stinking deal. He is currently president of the American Musicological Society and has done prize-winning work in several different fields. Recently, an article about Porgy and Bess as an American Wozzeck, and the MLA, the other MLA, the Music Librarian Association's Hill Award for a database of songs published in the United States by women composers. He has extraordinary range as a scholar from early modern, Beethoven, 19th and 20th century, and has a book coming out soon about the afterlife of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Ralph Hexter is Distinguished Professor of Classics and Comparative Literature and author of influential studies of Ovid, and most recently, the Oxford Handbook of Medieval Latin Literature. Who would have thunk that UC Davis would have a humanist as provost? And you know what, it doesn't seem to matter. He's just provost. But we, especially in this company, are glad to have a humanist provost speaking to us. So what we will do is start, I believe, with David, and then Bill, and then our 3 panelists will each give statements and responses, and then we'll form a proper panel and invite discussion from the audience. So thank you all for being here. David.
Thank you. Well, I offer these reflections today about the humanities, public education, and the common good, both as a dean of humanities and fine arts and as a scholar of the Enlightenment. As California has disinvested in public education, and as our society seems to have devalued the principles of a liberal arts education, I found myself thinking about the Enlightenment investment in education. Now, in the United States of America, in the decades after the American Revolution, education was seen as the sphere in which the Enlightenment, in all its philosophical and social and political dimensions, had to be put into practice. Public education and liberal education, defined as a common good and a public trust, constituted an Enlightenment project, an Enlightenment experiment within the larger Enlightenment experiment of the American Republic itself. So I want to recall this project today because I think it can help us to think about our past and our future. And I want to suggest, because the project of the Enlightenment must be continually reinvented. And for that reason, I begin and end in California. Now, the University of California, as I assume you know, was established in 1868. But the creation of a public university was anticipated in the original California State Constitution of 1849, which mandated a system of common schools and a university to promote literature, the arts, and sciences, and declared in its Article 9, the legislature shall encourage the promotion of intellectual, scientific, moral, and agricultural improvement. Now, this article was significantly expanded in the revised Constitution of 1879, which established a state-supported and autonomous University of California as a public trust. and incorporated a new preamble that affirmed that a general diffusion of knowledge and intelligence is essential to the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people. Now, these formulations are citations from the Enlightenment. This specific language is drawn from the section on education in the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, which was authored by John Adams. And it states, "Wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, are necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. And as these depend on spreading opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people, it shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods of this Commonwealth to cherish the interest of literature and the sciences and all seminaries of them." So the place of education, and higher education in particular, in the new state of California is from the outset framed in Enlightenment terms, as it was in the new Republic. The 1849 California Constitution was accompanied by an address to the people of California that really can be read as a kind of performative speech act, because it seeks to constitute Californians not only as a people, but also as the people, as it seeks to convince the people to seek to establish California as a state. In declaring that all political power is inherent in the people, and underlining its attention to individual rights as well as public liberty, the address to the people states that a free people must keep a watchful eye on the operations of their government and hold to strict accountability those to whom power is delegated. Declaring no people were ever yet enslaved who knew and dared maintain the correlative rights and obligations of free and independent citizens, this preamble makes a direct connection between the people's liberty and political power and their education, concluding that a knowledge of the laws, their moral force and efficacy, thus becomes an essential element of freedom and makes public education of primary importance. In other words, the Constitution itself, the rights and liberties of the people, depend on public education, including common schools, seminaries, and colleges, that will extend the blessings of education throughout the land and to the present and future generations. So Article 9 is thus the foundation of the political power of the people. The argument for the Constitution begins with an argument for public education. And indeed, I would argue that it begins with an argument for what was called liberal education and is now called the humanities. Now, this transition from rights of citizens to a knowledge of laws to a necessity of public education might seem like a non sequitur if it were not actually shorthand for a core Enlightenment argument, which is, in fact, a Jeffersonian argument. And Jefferson writes in 1778 that to promote the public happiness, those persons whom nature hath endowed with genius and virtue shall be rendered by liberal education worthy to receive and able to guard the sacred deposit of the rights and liberties of their fellow citizens without regard to wealth, birth, or other accidental condition or circumstance. And in 1782, he argues that public education is most justified in rendering the people the safe as they are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty. He explains that for this reason, he has proposed a specific curriculum, the reading in the first stage of education, he explains, where the people will receive their whole education, is chiefly historical. History, by apprising them of the past, will enable them to judge of the future. It will avail them of the experience of other times and other nations. It will qualify them as judges of the actions and designs of men. For Jefferson, laws to educate the common people are necessary to protect their rights and liberties, to prevent despotism, the rise of kings, priests, and nobles, and abuses of governmental power. And he writes, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. So it's this association of knowledge and history with rights and liberties and the people, a common construction of the American Enlightenment that the address to the people of California evokes in insisting that public education is of primary importance. Now, unlike California's Constitution, in fact, the United States Constitution does not include any provision about education. In his first address to Congress in 1790, President George Washington called upon Congress to promote science and literature by affording aids to seminaries of learning already established, or, he says, by the institution of a national university. And in his last address in 1796, he explicitly argued for a national university. And one of Washington's great frustrations was his failure to convince Congress to establish a national university. And indeed, despite the efforts of our first 6 presidents, public education was left to individual states. Yet nonetheless, there was a great deal of discussion about the need for education, for public education, and for liberal education, and in the context of the formation of the new American Republic. These were all seen as crucial. In 1796, the American Philosophical Society offered a $100 prize for a work presenting the best system of liberal education and literary instruction adapted to the genius of the government and best calculated to promote the general welfare of the United States. The 2 winners, Samuel Knox and Samuel Harrison Smith, called for a uniform system of national education in a publicly supported network of schools and colleges that culminated in a national university. And Knox and Smith, like many of their contemporaries, each argued for a Republican system of liberal education. Now, Washington made several arguments for the importance of promoting what he calls a flourishing state of the arts and sciences, which he saw as essential to national prosperity. He asserts that publicly financed institutions are very cheap instruments of immense national benefits, since they serve to assist a spirit of discovery and improvement and stimulate enterprise and experiment. And Washington follows his plea for a public investment in science and literature with a reference to the post office and post roads. Both education and post roads are public works, modes of communication that created what he called the sense of the community. And Benjamin Rush in 1787 also made this association between a national university and his proposal to convey newspapers free of all charge for postage, calling the post office the true non-electric wire of government. So this was really the internet of the 18th century. The Republic of Letters and the Republic of the United States depended on communication that created this sense of the community to create a nation. Washington believed that the common education of a national university would promote the assimilation of principles, opinions, and manners of our countrymen. The more homogeneous our citizens can be made in these particulars, the greater will be our prospect of permanent union. And other authors stressed the need for a national character, an American character. In 1778, David Ramsay predicted that the new republic and the arts and sciences would flourish together, that the arts and sciences will be cultivated, extended, and improved in independent America. A large volume of the book of nature, yet unread, is open before us and invites our attentive perusal. Echoing Hume, who asserted that it is impossible for the arts and sciences to arise at first among any people unless that people enjoy the blessing of a free government, Ramsay writes, "Our free governments are the proper nurturers of rhetoric, criticism, and the arts, which are founded on the philosophy of the human mind. And he anticipates that the free governments of America will produce poets, orators, critics, and historians equal to the most celebrated of the ancient commonwealths of Greece and Italy. Ramsay predicts that the American editions of the human mind will be more perfect than any that have yet appeared. In suggesting that the arts and sciences will cultivate an American culture, an American mind, an American character, a Republican character, Ramsay and his contemporaries did not merely imagine a national or nationalistic culture. Hume wrote, "A progress in the arts is rather favorable to liberty and has a natural tendency to preserve, if not produce, a free government. The Republic did more than offer new possibilities for the arts and sciences. It depended upon the arts and sciences for its creation." Extrapolating this philosophy of the human mind from Hume and Shaftesbury and Addison, 18th century American writers argue for the improvement of the mind. And Ramsay declares, eloquence is the child of a free state, because arguments about law and policy, he says, are enforced by the art of persuasion. The rising patriot, therefore, who wishes the happiness of his country, will cultivate the art of public speaking. Contrasting British government, which tended to crush the exertions of the human mind, with American government, in which all conspire to fan the sparks of genius in every breast, he anticipates what Smith describes as the collision of mind with mind in his discussion of why liberal education is best suited for a Republican system of government and must, he says, depend upon the general diffusion of knowledge and the capacity to think and speak correctly. So this is finally an argument about the relation between what we would today call democracy and what we would today call the humanities. It's also, in some ways, a good description of a liberal arts education, where the improvement of the mind, the effort to fan the sparks of genius in every breast, to increase knowledge and the capacity to think and speak, takes place in a community founded on dialogue, argument, and this collision of mind with mind. Now, Washington's 1790 annual message to Congress, which was drafted, by the way, by Madison, makes the Jeffersonian argument that the promotion of science and literature is necessary to the preservation of a free constitution. But what's remarkable is that he frames this as a pedagogical project. Washington argues that knowledge, and in a broader sense, the promotion of science and literature, contributes to the security of a free constitution by convincing those who are entrusted with the public administration that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people, and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights. So in a very long and complex sentence that goes on for several more lines, Washington presents this eloquent explanation of how the Enlightenment project of teaching the people constitutes the public good. And he focuses first not on teaching the people, but rather on teaching the legislature, those who are entrusted with the public administration, those legislators who in his 1796 message he described as too enlightened not to be fully sensible of the contributions of the arts and sciences. The legislators must be convinced that the ends of government should be answered by the enlightened confidence of the people. So government is seen as a dialogic relationship in which both those in power and the people must possess knowledge, must be taught, must be convinced and persuaded to have faith or confidence in the other. Both the legislators and the people are in need of enlightenment. What's at stake here is what the American Philosophical Society called the genius of the government. What the people are taught, what they have to teach, is not knowledge in either an abstract or a concrete sense, but rather knowing, how to know. Knowledge makes the free Constitution secure by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights. And I take this to mean that the people are not merely to be informed of their rights, they must be taught to know their rights and then to value them. That is to say, they must own their rights, they must acknowledge them in order to possess them. The people themselves must be able to recognize their rights in order to know themselves as the people. To value these rights, to distinguish and discern them, to understand that they have value, is to create them, to constitute the rights of the free Constitution. These rights, it seems, are not self-evident. They have to be taught, and they have to be believed in with enlightened confidence. For government to win the confidence of the people, those entrusted with public administration, the enlightened assembly, must recognize that the enlightenment of the people should be a primary end of government. The security of a free constitution depends on this enlightened mutual confidence. So these rights are not just the legacy of the Enlightenment, they are constituted by Enlightenment, by the ways of knowing and the ways of teaching that the Enlightenment represents. This is a personal project, a political project, a philosophical project, and ultimately a pedagogical project. Now, to conclude, let me acknowledge that in revolutionary America, the rights and liberties of citizens, and indeed the very categories of citizens and the people, were defined by exclusions based on gender, class, and race. And in this context, we would argue today that public education should not make people homogenous, but rather teach them about difference and diversity. Yet Smith argued that the enlightened citizen will know his rights and will understand the rights of others. The educational enterprise of the Enlightenment had and has an ineluctable logic that perpetuates itself if the people are persuaded to believe in the Constitution, if they become good readers of the Constitution and of history. This is why the mode of education proper in a republic, the literary instruction best suited for the genius of the government, was seen to be a liberal education based on this collision of mind with mind in a sympathetic union of individual citizens taught to reflect on themselves and others. In this imagined space, the early American republic becomes a republic of letters. Now, I don't have time to tell the 19th century sequel to this story, which culminates in the 1862 Morrill Land Grant Act, which allowed the states to sell federally owned lands and, with the proceeds, establish state colleges and led to the establishment of the University of California. This legislation led to a renewed vision of public education in the United States, a new sense of what it meant to teach the people, and a new debate about the promotion of the arts and sciences and the relative values of liberal and practical education. Coinciding with the reinvention of the American Republic after the Civil War, this educational movement represents a 19th century reinvention of the Enlightenment pedagogical project in a more democratic context. Today, as we think about how to teach the people at a moment when both public education and liberal education are being questioned, as we think about how the arts and sciences are needed to protect the rights and liberties of the people and a free constitution, we must learn from these efforts to put the Enlightenment into practice. Thank you.
I'm going to set my timer because if I don't, it's a 50-minute lecture, and you know how that goes. So, thank you, Dean Owens and Provost Hector, for this opportunity to be here and contribute to the conversation. And thank you for keeping these questions, the perennial questions, under discussion. There was a cluster of questions that you gave out under this header. They were what I think of as anxiety questions. And I want to orient my remarks by shifting the prompt question a bit to something slightly different, but I think useful in the context. How can we make the case to broader publics for the contributions of humanities teaching and humanities scholarship to the common good? I'm kind of going almost on everything opposite what David just did. So if we can meet up somewhere in the middle, that's going to be good. Because I'm going to look at the 21st century. I'm going to channel outside the academy voices. And I'm here to tell you that a liberal education is in danger of becoming useful. And we should think about seizing this as our Sputnik moment, maybe. Now, I'm going to focus more on practice and action, and this is perhaps my working through having been a dean for the last few years, because making the case for the humanities is basically what humanities deans do every day. Whether it's somebody with a lot of money that we want to bring on the inside of the institution, whether it's a prospective student, whether it's the parents of the prospective student, whether it's our alumni who are coming back and wanting to feel like it was just like it was in the old days, but we've changed. And whether it's our colleagues and in other kinds of cultural institutions that feel either related to or alienated from the proper university, and partly by the way in which we interact with them. And then there are, that's not to mention all the folks inside the Beltway. So I'm happy to take the we in this question of how can we make the case to be centered as humanities academics and inside a public R1 university. So I will be parochial in that regard. But one of the things that I want to say is that we cannot do this effectively or very often even credibly all by ourselves. It looks too self-interested sometimes when we do this, even though I'm completely accepting the wonderful character of what we do, and it's about making the case for it. We need to identify our allies in making the case and get comfortable with, as academics, with the need to work with and through them to change the perceptions, which are not, it's not unrealistic to have these anxiety questions. Now, these it's going to also be important as I go through this, which is really kind of an exercise in rhetorical engineering. I am a linguist, I am a semanticist, and everything looks like a semantics problem to me. So that's what it looks like to me. And so I've collected a lot of stories that have worked from my various conversations, and I'm going to lard them into these remarks in hopes that they might be useful to you in a moment facing someone to whom you're trying to make the case for what we do. And if that happens, that will be a good thing, I think. Now, these kinds of forums and debates, which are stimulated by anxieties, come up from the academic anxieties and public concerns periodically. Every once in a while, they break out into a national commission that thinks and then reports, and that attempt to bridge somehow the academic and the public audiences, describing the predicament and making recommendations for solutions. I'll give you an example. The commission believes that the humanities are a social good and that their well-being is in the national interest. Much of our system of education shows signs of deterioration, notably the secondary schools. Public confidence in education as an institution has declined seriously. Tax cuts, spending limitations, and narrow application of the Back to Basics movement result in education built on principles of management and quantitative measurement. Many students in schools and colleges avoid broad intellectual development in favor of acquiring immediate job skills. Teachers of the humanities see the diminishing numbers of students in their courses as a mark of society's indifference to their work. Declining enrollments provide an excuse for trimming the humanities in schools and cutting departmental budgets in colleges and universities. In many institutions, the undergraduate curriculum lacks continuity and coherence in the humanities itself and in their relation to other fields. And large numbers of graduate students and young PhDs in the humanities cannot find academic jobs. These may sound contemporary, but they come from the introduction to the report from the 1978 Commission on the Humanities that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and whose report was published by UC Press in 1980. The report makes 38 recommendations to fix this power situation, the vast majority of which are of the form, give X more money, where X is somebody we would like. But here are some of the others, because they resonate and have currency now, and they're one end of a vector of rhetoric that I'm going to draw through the next version of this. Here's one that sounds familiar. Educators must reaffirm the value of the humanities and demonstrate their contribution to education and the public life. Give fresh meaning to liberal education, emphasizing its role and the role of the humanities for developing mental capacities and historical knowledge that are needed for, and then there's a whole long list of things they're needed for. Strengthen undergraduate education in the humanities by spreading writing instruction across the course of study and developing courses and sequences that integrate themes across humanities disciplines and with other fields of study. Humanities faculty should confer with professional school faculty to discuss the preparation in the humanities that is needed for success in professional schools. Graduate education in the humanities should consider how its purposes and curriculum might better be adapted to both academic and non-academic employment. Colleges and universities should encourage their faculty to help improve humanities education and teacher development for the high schools and for the community colleges. And educational and cultural institutions should collaborate with each other, both for intellectual and financial reasons. Now, I put these out as a kind of initial point to draw a line between these. They sound pretty contemporary to me. And the next, or the most recent, I should say, instance of the great National Commission of Worrying About Things and the Advice for the Humanities. That's in a report called, well, it was a Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. Now, after 30-some years, the social sciences have been lumped together with that. I think the report is called The Heart of the Matter. I think of it as actually being titled Not by STEM Alone, because it's the sister report to Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and so the humanities and social sciences are the representative of the other with respect to STEM, right? So that's how we got to be a category that way. But nonetheless, my colleague Jim Clifford has a very nice little essay called The Greater Humanities, which isn't as imperialistic as it sounds, that I recommend to you, which says this is a kind of natural category as well. At any rate, if you haven't read it, you should look at it, because it's trying to be a national consensus with some credibility in making the case for a liberal arts education as a practical matter for the 21st century. And as usual, with the humanities at the heart of it, but not the sole occupant of the liberal arts education. My science colleagues are very touchy when they hear people say things like, well, obviously, liberal education, it's about the humanities. No, it's about the liberal arts and sciences. It's a big galaxy. It's more about learning for learning's sake, broadening, a whole bunch of things we can put together there. But I think it's important for those of us in the humanities not to get too tunnel visioned down in this category. We share it with a lot of allies, and we don't want to piss off any of our allies. But this case for the liberal arts education becoming practical is founded in this particular report, but it's also, I will say, exactly what I heard when I started putting together my Dean's Council of Advisors from alumni and going around and finding these successful alumni in professional fields and who had humanities degrees and say, talk to me about why this makes sense. Right? And I recommend everybody do that with your alumni. The stories are very compelling. Our best advocates and most non-self-interested articulators of this argument are many of our alumni in that regard. But it's founded on the idea that we live in a constantly changing world. We're just forever, it's going to be just like this, constantly changing. Right? The only change is constant. Oh no, the only constant is change. And it's a flat world. There's the flat part that says, oh dear, we lost our privilege in the West. But there's also the flatness that says it is now possible in a way that has never been before, both physically and, of course, in terms of discourse, for people to be interacting each other, bridging across wide cultural and linguistic gaps. And if you're going to do that productively, which has got a real economic twist to it, not just a happy cultural twist, you're going to have to prepare people to live in this world. They're going to have to know the past. They're going to have to understand themselves through knowledge, intimate and direct knowledge of others. They're going to have to be extraordinarily good at integrative thinking and imagination for creative and constant discovery, because what you knew the day that you walked out of school is not going to be true very long after. We have to keep developing skills for good citizenship. Otherwise, I don't know where we'll be. And productive engagement across these differences of culture and politics are central to our futures in this flat and constantly changing world. So if you read this report, you read this material, you say, why do I think the world is all full of people who just want job skills? Well, let me just dissertate on that for a moment. If you think that education is about getting a life and training is about getting a job, I mean, that's the basic distinction that the Department of Education uses: training and education, training and education, training and education. It's important not to fall into the false dichotomy that the people who get a life don't need a job, especially with what they have to borrow to get that life through a liberal education these days. We can't look at any of our students and do what was customary a few years ago to say, oh, don't worry about it, something will come up. No, you got to think about this from the very time you get into college now. Even if you're completely committed to the kind of mind-expanding, critical analysis that you're going to get in a really strong liberal education, you have got to remember that when you get out of the school, what is your next step, and how are you going to succeed in that world? So I don't think we should ever be dismissive of those concerns, and I also don't think that hearing that concern about what are you going to do after you graduate is somehow a critique of the value of a liberal arts education. It is not, but it's life. So I've got three things that I want to put out there as the way I think of genres of connections between the work we do and how I talk about them. One's about the education, one's about the research argument, and one's about the allies. So on this newfound usefulness of a liberal arts education, the future of the humanities in education, I think, is inextricably tied to the growing support for a revitalized liberal arts education. I don't think that's going to go away. It's seen as the best foundation for professional success, not just as you get out of school, but navigating that life. It isn't just about richer meaning, it's that, but it's also about how are you going to have those 17 jobs that we think you're going to have over the time. That world is going to be a world of change, and it's kind of summed up in probably everyone in the room has seen some version of the Shift Happens, Did You Know movie that undergraduate deans show on the first day when the freshmen come in and say, by the way, the top 10 high demand jobs in 2010 did not exist 4 years before. So how in the world do we know what job you're going to have in 4 years? You better learn how to learn while you're here. To educators, we say we are currently preparing students for jobs that don't exist yet, using technologies that we haven't invented yet to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet. So how do you think the syllabuses of my course are going to reflect immediately obvious things? What we're learning here is something else. I mean, I think that's the thing that has made it more credible to make a practical argument for a liberal arts education. If you don't, sometime after that first report I made, the American Association of Colleges and Universities was founded and started out on this campaign of saving the liberal arts education for the 21st century. Their website contains a lot of stuff to look at, and it's all involved in this rhetoric of making the liberal arts education practical. If you look at it and you say, ugh, I want to do something else, fine. But if you ever come face to face with this question and need to make it work, there's a lot of good resources there. Now, that's how the education piece works, and if I had longer, I would point out that that's all about everybody getting a general education, and it's hard to connect that up with individual majors, but I don't have time to tease those apart. Because I want to get on to the research piece, because the other anxiety about making your case is that it's very natural to find stories where if you've got humanities research project that's what we could call engaged, drawing its problems from a community, solving them or addressing them in some way and returning the value to the community. There's a very obvious contribution there, but there's this worry about whether that would turn everything that we were doing into something less than the wonderful, what I think of, sometimes pure is a loaded word, but think of it as random walk research, right? Whatever I'm interested in right now, if I'm really interested in it, I'll do a good job with this project, and somehow down the road, something good will come of it. I think of this as a classic example of this. In 2012, I've been blessed in my life in linguistics to always be around a Mayan linguist, so I've sort of followed the amazing detail over the last 40 years of analyzing the glyphs and the languages and doing the reconstruction. Why would you do that? And then 2012 comes and we find out it was all very important to find out whether the world was going to end, right? I mean, it was like enormous amounts of money were made on all my friends' basic research in linguistics. But that's not why they did it, of course. But it was a nice side effect that some of these people who had worked for decades in isolation and invisibility suddenly became the kind of heroes that you normally see in Ken Burns films, done well as well, you know, where you suddenly an academic says something that the public wants to listen to. That's an example of a bridge between, take Ken Burns as a better example than the Mayan apocalypse, between the academy and people who do the research in the normal way that we think in a research university, but they deliver it across a bridge of relevance and presentation into a language that the larger public understands and appreciates and can realize that it wasn't possible to do that without the academics behind them. And I see I am running out of time, so I'll say that there is a way, and we can talk about it later. I'll just plant the cute title that I came up with here for this section, which was A Bridge Over Troubled Aquifers, named after two very nice essays. Pauline Yu's stump speech on the humanities without apology quotes a colleague of making the point that the academy is like an aquifer that's constantly renewed. It's not a spigot that you can go and turn on if you haven't put water in the aquifer for a long time. And I think that's a kind of representation to people about why it's important to keep doing research, and even though it's not immediately evident, as long as you then mate it at the time that it becomes relevant and visible with the bridge that says, wasn't it cool that we did that 30 years ago? Because now we can do this. And that gives you an argument by example of why you would keep investing in that kind of stuff. Finally, we have allies everywhere if we look for them. And I will just give as an example, museums, libraries, historical societies, these kinds of cultural institutions are in the same business. They are our industry partners. Unlike my colleague, the Dean of Engineering's industry partners, they are not the donors of large amounts of money in order to get something done. But they are great partners to work with because local museums have fan bases and are good at being relevant and delivering our work to broader publics. And by becoming friends of these kinds of institutions and being useful to them, we get a halo effect for the work that we do as well. So I just wanted to leave you with those three thoughts, and thank you for your attention.
Okay. Okay. Does that work? Can everybody hear me? Okay, well, thank you all for being here. And I, too, wanted to thank Dean Owens, Jessie Ann Owens, for having had the seed idea for this forum. And I'd also like to thank Ralph Hexter for having welcomed us into his series. I've been thinking a bit about what's the difference between social good, public good, and common good. I think there would be an interesting discussion of those terms' histories, but that's not what I want to do today. I want very briefly to say that if there's one feature that most discussions of the humanities have in common, it's surely the rhetorical form of the defense. This is a form about which I actually wrote my first book way back in 1974. My tenure book was not my dissertation, but it was a book about the genre of the defensive poetry, which in some ways starts with Plato's banishing of the poets from the Republic, not on the grounds that they are useless exactly, but on the grounds that they haven't yet demonstrated their utility. And they are to be allowed back in once they do make that case. That's in Book 10 of the Republic. And it seems to me that sometimes I feel like I've never moved beyond that early work in my own life, and certainly in my current role as MLA president, which has been a very steep learning curve for me and for my family, I must say, in terms of time management. I do a lot of thinking about the genre of the defense, and in particular about the defenses of the humanities that have been made in the wake of the report that Bill was mentioning, The Heart of the Matter, and that are being made around the country in very pragmatic terms by chairs who feel that they actually do need more money from their deans in order to do the kind of teaching that, not just the kind of teaching they've always done, because most of us have learned to do many different kinds of teaching since we were, if you're my age, since we were graduate students, but in order to do the things that we think we should be doing well for a very different student body. It's certainly changed in the 15 years that I've been at Davis, and I wish I could go back and get some more linguistics training in ESL. I think I would be a better teacher if I had that. And so the request for money, while it must seem to every administrator to be just never ending, going all the way back to Plato's Republic, is actually not just boring, it's a request for resources. And it won't stop. I've also been thinking a lot about the genre of the defense from a very humble new job that I had actually for the first time last week, which was to be part of a phone bank attempting to get freshmen who've been admitted to Davis and who say that they might want to major in English to actually come. We haven't done this before. Our department maybe should have done more of this before, but it was very interesting. The hour and a half that I spent on the phone, I got lots of busy signals, some wrong numbers. I got 2 or 3 parents who spoke languages that I couldn't speak back to them. Hmong was one of them, but Spanish we kind of went along, and I learned that their student would be back later and might be interested in calling me back. But I also learned from parent after parent. I got more parents than kids, actually, in my particular hour-and-a-half stint. I learned that they are worried about what will their child do afterwards. They're looking at this huge debt. Even going to a public university, it's way more than it was when they were going. And I talked to one mom who was a pharmacist, and she said, well, he wants to major in English. He's just had his first C ever in calculus. Will this keep him out of Davis? And I said, I don't think so. And then she said, I just don't see what he's going to do with this. So I did exactly what you were suggesting, which is to say, I can tell you great stories about what our alums are doing who have this major. And in fact, I do have some good stories about this, and I think we ought to collect more of those stories. But I found myself making a defense of what the student might do in terms that were very oriented toward the parents' concerns, which were concerns about what their child was going to live on after college. Now, it seems to me that the prevalence of defense when discussing the humanities, either at the national level or at the very local level of trying to persuade parents to support their children's desire, if they already have it in high school, we should nurture that, they may change their minds very soon, suggests that the humanities are perennially under attack and have been perhaps since their inception. However we think about that origin story, what are the humanities? They're perennially declared to be in a state of crisis, and they seem to have emerged as university disciplines by a different route than the natural and social sciences, both earlier than those disciplines and left over after the sciences achieved prominence at the turn of the 20th century. This is the view, at least, of Lawrence Vesey, who, in an article called The Plural or Organized World of the Humanities, writes that what we call the humanities now were, in fact, what was left after the social sciences separated from the American Council of Learned Societies and formed their own organization, the Social Science Research Council, in 1923. Thank you. The natural sciences had established their professional autonomy much earlier. See if I can put that someplace where I'm not going to. Oh, okay. All right. Yes, I don't want to spill it into that hole, lest my microphone suddenly go. Vesey goes so far as to question whether the remaining disciplines can be credited with any coherence at all. He says that we are left with the possibility that the grouping of fields of history, English, classical and modern languages, philosophy, art, and music may at bottom be nothing more than a growing convenience, perhaps especially for deans and university presidents in neatly structuring their organizations. He has a form of what I'd call institutional nominalism, and it's bracing, but I think it leaves the humanities with a very difficult task of defense. Almost always, scholars have risen to this task by making the argument that the humanities are uniquely valuable for their beneficial social effects, their particular utility in making better persons, better citizens. This claim has a long history which traces the humanities to the program of the Renaissance humanists, who did indeed make claims of this sort for their pedagogy, and they called their program famously the Studia Humanitatis, or sometimes the Literae Humanioris. The invocation of the human signaled their embrace of the classical notion of humanitas, realized above all in the art of bene dicende, or speaking well. This art, otherwise known as rhetoric, raised the study of language in antiquity above the merely intuitive acquisition of one's native tongue. For the Greek and Roman rhetoricians, the art of speaking well was the highest expression of what was most essentially human, what elevated humankind above the animals. In a time when we are no longer certain that we are ontologically separate from the other animals, as Milton reminds us, we are one of the creatures. It seems to me that thinking about the humanities as the art of speaking well, but also an art that it goes back to the legal courtroom, to the the defense and the prosecution in those cases may be a useful way to go. And it seems to me that the kinds of defenses that are coming from the report, The Heart of the Matter, are not really helping us to think about what is distinctive about the humanities in terms of their object of inquiry and in terms of their methodology. And if you remember, I don't know how many of you have actually read The Heart of the Matter, but I'll just give my little spiel on it briefly. It's clearly a commission that worked very hard, worked very long, worked over various kinds of different assumptions among the members of the commission. But with all due respect to that work, it seems to me that the strategy of the report breaks no new ground in the defense of its subject, which is, as Bill remarked, the humanities and the social sciences. The report's recommendations are all unobjectionable, but they amount to the usual hortatory rhetoric: promote, support, encourage. Rather than explain what humanities scholars study, what they do, the authors tell us, once again, that along with the social sciences, the humanities teach us, this is a quotation, to question, analyze, debate, interpret, synthesize, compare evidence, and communicate. All true. But how do humanities disciplines in particular accomplish these aims? By studying their particular objects. And how is this process different from the kinds of analysis, debate that we have in the social sciences and indeed in the physical sciences, especially when the subject of debate is money for basic research where you cannot predict the utility of your product in advance? And it seems to me that if we're going to begin to think about these questions, and obviously I'm not going to in the 2 or 3 minutes remaining to me, that we would do well to think about what is distinctive about the humanities objects of study. And here I would invoke the name of John Guillory, who teaches at NYU, and who has made an argument that the object of study of the humanities are documents and monuments. That this is what humanities work, humanities scholarship pays attention to. Documents from the past, from the present, documents that are partially frayed and possibly have to be restored and re-edited, and also monuments, that is, the objects that record the memories of cultures and that can, of course, also sometimes be torn down. That's a very brief window onto a kind of argument that some scholars, Guillory leading, but many others are making versions of this, have been attempting in the last few years. As for the method of study that seems to me worth remarking as, if not unique to the humanities, at least central to the public work that they do in the university community and also beyond it, I would single out that word, interpretation. And I do that in part in response to a talk that some of you in this audience may have heard a few weeks ago, namely the talk by Robert Post, who is the dean of the Yale Law School and who was brought here by Ralph to talk to us about academic freedom and the Constitution. Now, in that talk, Dean Post made a somewhat, I'm assuming, polemical statement where he drew on Dewey's distinction between disciple and discipline to distinguish between those fields that have disciplines. Wissenschaft, he invoked the German word for the sciences of knowledge, and he seemed to be thinking of that in terms of the hard sciences. Those are the disciplines where there is testing and there is real knowledge produced, and there are cures for cancer, and there is, who would dispute the utility of that? On the other hand, he had those fields that have disciples in them, where they proceed, his example was a creative writer who proceeds solely by charisma to attract large crowds. And clearly the disciple-discipline distinction is very appealing if you just look at it briefly. I, however, was desperate to be able to ask a question of Dean Post, and I didn't get my chance to do that. So I'm taking this time now to get my belated answer to him, which is A, disciple and discipline are, in fact, part of the same word family. And when Milton writes his Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, his discipline is about the discipline of following Jesus Christ as a disciple. In many, many contexts, these two terms cannot be so simply distinguished. And I also wanted to say to Dean Post, and I thought it might be worth saying to you all too, that he is ignoring his own discipline, that is the law, in making this distinction, because the law, like literature and like some other fields within the humanities and the social sciences, has a discipline, that is a body of knowledge that is drawn on, that is critiqued, that is questioned, that is sometimes changed, but it also has a discipleship. It has a relationship to authoritative texts that sometimes people think of as based on religion rather than on critical analysis. Look at the originalists and how they feel about the Constitution. That is a form of disciple thinking that comes into the very discipline of law. So I wanted to suggest that somewhere in the middle between his polemical characterization of the creative writer out there, he didn't say a professor of classics, but he could have, who's attracting the children as if he were the Pied Piper and leading them away from utility, and the notion of discipline that he was giving, I think possibly not in an altogether up-to-date way, to the hard sciences. There are these fields where the interpretation is ongoing, it's contested, and it's also necessary. Think not just for documents and monuments as the object of study, but also for communication between the generations. So that's what I had to say briefly.
Thank you, Dean Owens. Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate the invitation. I was not initially positive that I would accept it, but as I thought about things I might say, I thought, in fact, yes, there is something I can contribute here. Artistic expression and the enjoyment of that expression are at the core of what it means to be human, and thus the arts and the study of the arts are at the core of the humanities. I'd like to begin my remarks by speaking from the standpoint of what the arts contribute to the common good, and to do so from a perspective that is at first local. An attempt to demonstrate broader implications of the local common good follow. The arts at UC Davis, as at other institutions, are often touted as one of the primary public faces of the university. Indeed, the choreographer Kota Yamazaki sees this as one of the main functions of art. The artist, she says, should act as a kind of mediator of a different culture and field to the public. In the 12 years that the Mondavi Center for the Performing Arts has existed, the concerts, dances, and spectacles that they have produced have made Davis into a regional mecca for the performing arts. Although situated in this town of 65,000, the Mondavi Center attracts upwards of 100,000 people a year, and has done so for over a decade now. You can do the math. We're well over 1 million. Given the variety of their programming, we ought not to speak of one audience, but rather of several. Because I have eclectic tastes, I experience every year the astonishing variety of audiences that stream into Mondavi several nights a week. The modern dance audience, the classical music audiences, the Hindustani, the rock, the folk, the alternative adult contemporary indie audiences. Sometimes when attending successive events of very different musics, I have the impression that aside from the Mondavi staff, my wife and I are among a handful of people who were in both audiences. But the word audience does not do justice to what Mondavi creates in our region. It is far too passive, suggesting only that Mondavi presents and the ticket holders receive. Community seems better. Communities better still. If enlightened programming choices are one reason for Mondavi's achievements in community building, another equally important is their ability to create opportunities for people to feel that they have a stake in the success of this community building venture. The list of Mondavi donors has grown by the year and now numbers over 1,300. And their outreach and educational initiatives assure that the average age of their communities is well below 60. This brief summary of what Mondavi has achieved is no less true of our arts departments, including my academic home, the Department of Music. We have for decades sponsored over 100 musical events a year, reaching thousands of departmental supporters, students, and alums. When I arrived in Davis in 1985, these concerts were almost entirely devoted to works by European and American classical composers. Since then, the department has replicated the expansion of its musical offerings, the kind of openness to global cultures that have been evident in humanistic studies writ large. First came classes and concerts in jazz. Now we have a gamelan ensemble, a Hindustani choir, and samba and Korean percussion ensembles. The experiences students have singing in a choir, playing in the orchestra, beating a drum or striking a gong translate decades later into grateful alumni eager to maintain their connections by giving generously to the department or the university. This communal spirit is evident at Davis to an extent that is extraordinary at a relatively young public university. Does this matter? Or more pointedly, does this matter to this afternoon's theme? I think it does in several ways. As performers in a play or a concert, we early on become aware of how, by being a member of a larger group working towards a common goal, we can achieve something that none of us could do on our own. Perhaps the fact that musicologists generally are trained first as musicians and then as scholars has something to do with the remarkable number of musicologists around the country who have become deans and upper-level administrators, including here at Davis, where 2 of the 5 people who have served as Dean of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies have been musicologists. While this phenomenon cries out for a sociological study, in the absence of a reasoned argument about why this is so, I offer my own armchair theory. Musicologists have acquired the intellectual skills necessary to make a career in academia, but we have acquired them on top of an ability to collaborate that we've learned first of all by participating in musical performances. Students and practitioners of all the arts experience throughout their educations and careers something that recent studies of creativity have begun to recognize, that, quote, collaboration is the secret to innovation. The reasons to study the arts are many and venerable. I almost said vulnerable. Oh. And they are no less valid for other branches of the humanities. Among these, the ability to appreciate and understand a Beethoven string quartet, a Georgia O'Keeffe canvas, a Tom Stoppard play, or a poem by Alice Walker has long been considered all the justification one needs to study the humanities. However, the fact that we are having this discussion today is just one of many indications that venerable justifications for the humanities may not carry the weight they once did. Just yesterday, the UC Humanities Research Institute mailed out David Theo Goldberg's inaugural essay in a series on critical conditions concerning the humanities. But on the other hand, I find it easy to align myself with those who say that in the face of the problems that currently afflict this country and the world, the lessons and beauties of art are not less valuable, they are ever more so, and not just because they offer us a way to make sense of our human condition. In these remarks, I've been conflating 3 different aspects of the arts and the contributions they make to the common good. 1, there is, first of all, the artwork itself, which represents or critiques or otherwise communicates something that those who apprehend it enjoy or need or want. 2, there is the act of presenting the artwork, which, depending on the medium, can bring together many hundreds of people and give them a common purpose to perform. And 3, there is the community of people who give their time and money in order to join in a community of people who share a common interest. It impresses me time and again that although people can now listen to music perfectly performed in ultra-high fidelity in the privacy of their own homes, undisturbed by coughers, errant cell phones, and the odd snorer, that they nevertheless prefer to come out for the communal experience of listening, squeezed in among a few friends, many acquaintances, and lots of total strangers. It is a more human way to experience art. All three of these aspects work together. But in the decades and generations to come, the contribution of art studies to developing collaborative skills and sensibilities is particularly essential. If we are to solve such looming catastrophes as global warming and overpopulation, we must recognize that humanists and artists have as much a role to play in this effort as scientists, because these are not just scientific problems. We are truly all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you for all the talks and the commentaries. It's interesting to me how an interesting texture is being woven together. And so I have to say that Dean Ladusaw was so right to remind us there is not a dichotomy, and certainly there's a false dichotomy when we say you can't have preparation in the humanities, arts, and practical training. However, I need to invoke some of those parents that, Margie, you were talking to. Thank you for making those calls. To start my rhetoric, because I begin with that false dichotomy. And we so often hear that the humanities are a waste of time, keeping our young people from learning worthwhile practical pursuits and preparing for gainful employment, that I thought I might begin with the words of someone who claims to have been born for the humanities, or in this individual's vocabulary, poetry. In a nice reversal, in his view, it was the time he was forced to spend preparing for careers in business and law that's the waste. And I quote, "While nature has brought forth others for other pursuits, in my opinion, and on the basis of my experience, it produced me from my mother's womb disposed to poetic ponderings. That's what I was born for. How clearly do I remember how my father, from my childhood, did his everything to see that I become a businessman. He had me, not yet a teenager, instructed in arithmetic and apprenticed me to a great merchant in whose home I wasted 6 years, time I will never recover. It being clear from this and other indices that I seem to have more aptitude for the study of letters, my father ordained that I should study canon law, and under the auspices of a renowned teacher, I wasted just about the same amount of time as I had on previous vain pursuits. I hated this utterly, so that neither the learning of my teacher nor the authority of my father, who pressed me ceaselessly with new commands, nor even the pleadings and warnings of my friends could warm me to either of these two pursuits. So strongly did my heart incline me to poetry." This young man, pressed to be either a businessman or a lawyer, was none other than Giovanni Boccaccio, who goes on to describe his own early and spontaneous poetic efforts, claiming that if he had not been forced to devote so much time when young, first to mercantile and then to legal studies, when he could have been reading literature, he might have become a really fine poet. Now, he didn't do too badly all in all, and one might indeed suggest that his legal training was somewhat productive for his future literary efforts. But while it might be worthwhile for even more than the balance of time I have today to talk about Boccaccio's works, let me simply hoist his name high and fly under his banner when I take exception to, indeed deplore, the coarse assertions, explicit and implicit, we hear time and time again that the value of education is to be measured solely or even primarily by one's lifetime earnings. Nan Cohane, in a talk I much admire, makes the case for undergraduate years as a time of self-fashioning. Cohane is the former president of Wellesley College and Duke University, and her talk was originally delivered to students at Stanford University, but I would very much reject the notion that the opportunity for young adults to discover themselves is one our society affords only to the wealthy, available only at the wealthiest private universities and colleges. Such a restriction would not only be unjust, it would sap the strength, and I would argue the long-term sustainability of the entire community, because we need not just as many adults as we can have who have found their individual strengths, but individuals who question. For the way, in other words, we need to value the humanities and the liberal arts more broadly for the way they promote the constant questioning of society's values and assumptions. This is never truer than today, when the mercantile media machine runs nonstop to interpolate us as mere consumers, and where individuality has been devalued into market niches and targets. As Boccaccio's example shows, families and societies have almost from the beginning of time animadverted against education in the liberal arts, especially if such education promotes questioning. Nearly 2,500 years ago, in Aristophanes' Cloud, the father, Strepsiades, was so outraged at the questions his son has been learning to ask at school that he torches the school. Its schoolmaster, none other than Socrates. Now, Strepsiades is on to something, for philosophy and the humanities more broadly indeed teach us that things are not always the way they seem. They teach us to question, in that they are not unlike the sciences, since in so many ways science helps observers penetrate to clearer understandings of superficial phenomena, driving down to atomic and subatomic levels. Now, while we in the humanities have our own versions of exacting analysis, we do not find our verities with ever more expensive microscopes, and in place of replicability, we have the weight of the evidence we array combined with the persuasiveness of our analysis and argument. But somehow, the questions that the humanities asks and the appearances that study of the humanities can unmask are more disquieting today, at least to greater numbers of our fellow citizens. We're thrilled when new cures are discovered, or charmed when we learn why the zebra has its stripes, as UC Davis announced on April 1st, which, by the way, led to inquiries from the press whether this was in fact an April Fool's Day joke or serious science. It was in fact the latter. But it's more problematic if our modes of inquiry lead us to question some of the deeper and constitutive assumptions of our society, when, for example, it leads us to ask about inequality or to question privilege. Here I might offer a couple of personal examples as I see some steps of my own self-education and self-liberation as rooted in literary analysis. I recall already in high school and early years of college struggling to come out as a gay man and deconstructing the word natural, first crudely on my own, and then with the help of John Stuart Mill's essay on nature. A couple of decades later, when AIDS had already taken a vast toll and resistance to distributing condoms had taken many forms, including the argument that there was no such thing as safe sex, I remember hearing a government official quoted actually heard him on NPR, assuring the public in the wake of some train accident that rail travel was nonetheless completely safe. Aha, I said to myself, safe doesn't have anything to do with data. It's the power and privilege of the speaker to declare something safe and be believed. These are simple, even simplistic examples, of course, but if everyone were armed with the tools of literary analysis, and if members of the public felt empowered to demand truth and decry cant, and to do so as individuals, not just when whipped into one frenzy or another by media and politicians who know how to channel skepticism into cynicism, we'd be living in a much better society. Let me conclude by saying that I'm tired of mere defenses of the humanities. Let's move from playing defense to playing offense, nicely, of course. What we need today, to use a friend that Margie will recognize at once, and you will all now too, for it's probably her early work that brought it to my attention, is a defense and illustration of the humanities. When Du Bellay in the 16th century took up the cause of the French language as a serious medium to rival and in some sectors best Latin, he just didn't defend the language, he illustrated it. He made it shine by using it beautifully, making it more brilliant, not only by the words in his essays, but by his poetry. His fellow Pleiades did likewise. we can illustrate the power of the humanities by showing how they help us on a daily basis be better and tireless seekers of the truth and better and more persuasive combatants on that field. That's how we make the humanities shine.
You're a very patient audience, and it's your turn now to enter this fray. And I've asked the speakers and the panelists to sit up front, and I would like to invite anyone who has questions to direct their questions to any of the speakers. We have a microphone, and I'd ask you to stand to ask your question and then also to identify yourself. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Harley Litzman. I'm a freshman here in Sociology and American Studies. So listening to these lectures, there's this great promising understanding that a revitalized liberal arts education is the core of an educated citizenry prepared for a climate of change. But I work in student advocacy in ASUCD, and I simultaneously work to educate students about issues that affect them, convince them that they can do anything about it, and then help them do whatever they can possibly do. And what I see is that there's this crucial lack of civic awareness, of participation, and most importantly, responsibility, missing from the academic culture and expectations of UC Davis, and from what I understand, the entire American college-age demographic. So, as an undergraduate student with plenty of time left.
And the question? We got lots of people, so make it.
I'm right
Okay.
there. So I have basically two questions, but you can kind of tie it together. How can we improve general education requirements and course catalog to reflect liberal arts education? And how do we revitalize broad pedagogy and curricula of these courses to empower an academic culture of civic engagement and justice? Thank you.
If you drill deeper, and what I didn't have time to do was read the blah, blah, blah that they say a liberal education will give you. It's supposed to, citizenship always comes up there. And a critique from the point of view of someone looking at the curriculum would be to ask, to what extent do you know that this walk through these courses has anything to do with what's going on over here? You know, how does it do it? I think those are all fair questions, and I encourage students to question their faculty in that way. I think that in my experience, and my campus is one that's founded on a certain ideology about colleges and communities and what you learn in the classroom and what you learn not in the classroom. But in our program, I think the best learning in citizenship goes on in the co-curriculum, in the student orgs, in the students who are committed to doing kind of things like that. I ran an internship program when I was undergraduate dean each year where people had real projects they were working on in the university, and we had to talk about how do you figure out how to work with people? How do you figure out how to get over disagreements? Those are things that at least don't fit into a nice faculty member's classroom sometimes as easily as they do. Finding those engaged learning opportunities, still credit bearing often, still intentionally designed, but you have to look at the curriculum as bigger than your major. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about that worries me a lot is the idea that as academics, I mean, we're the people who never got out of school, right? We just sort of stayed there. We are our majors. And we're kind of not the most qualified people to understand what it looks like from that student point of view. I think of my banker alumnus who tells me he couldn't be a moral banker without his religious studies degree, right? You know, those two things fit together in a way for academics. We don't often hear that. So I think those are very good questions. I don't want to promise you that it's there, but I think it should be a faculty-student conversation about where we learn what and how what we're doing is preparing us for those things. I think those are outstanding questions.
Thank you very much. I saw someone in the back.
Basically, my question is, how did we get here? There's an awful lot of discussion in this meeting about defense of the humanities, and not too much discussion of how we got here. And in my life, this is a rather perplexing issue, because I began where it was exactly the opposite, where it was a given that students were going to college to get an education, and talk about how much money you would make was crass and uncool. And I spent at least a decade defending being a physics major against the claim that this was something that served the oppression and murder of the war machine. And it's, of course, reversed tremendously since then. Why isn't it obvious that a lot more people are going to benefit from what they learn in skills of writing and rhetoric if you want to talk about making a living, than are ever going to need calculus or even algebra, much less quantum mechanics, to be successful. It's a tiny number of the people in the latter category that make a life of it, and virtually everyone in the former category needs to write well and communicate well to be successful. So how did we get here? Why isn't all this obvious? I don't get it.
Sort of history or trajectory of this, but do you have to keep your... Someone has to keep his or her finger on I can do it. But I do think that for whatever reasons, there's a kind of self-perpetuating hysteria that's going on now. It's completely understandable, and I agree with everything that Bill was saying, that students with debt and parents and families worried about economic uncertainty would be concerned with these questions, and they're not taking it for granted about why they're going to college or what it's going to lead to. On the other hand, if you go back at some of the 18th century examples I was quoting, there are other 19th, 20th centuries examples you could give, there's a constant need to explain that a university education is not a vocational school. And you can find those sorts of same speeches being made at that same time. But I do think that it's reached a crisis point now. And part of the problem, to, I think, echo what others were saying today, is we need to do a better job of explaining what we do and what you can do with it. And also, I think that, we're also seeing from an unfortunate not only an unfortunate and false correlation between a major and a job and a salary, which no one has ever argued, but also I think between, departments and disciplines and majors, and then what it is that we actually do and what our objects of study are. So people don't understand those things, and right now it's sort of reached this sort of this moment of maximum misunderstanding, which is really causing a problem for us.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jorge Rojas, and I work for UC Davis, mainly in Latin America. And what I have seen in my country, Chile, is a huge challenge, which is to reform the education. And I also see in Chile, and which is also connected with what happened in the rest of Latin America, that humanities are not a priority. You can see figures like funding for humanities, like how do the students get accepted to the different universities. It's not quite much selective right now as it used to be before. And when people and our policymakers, our governors, they are thinking on reforming the education, they are not looking eventually to humanities as the very priority. I want to ask Provost Hexer, because he has been in Latin America working with our colleagues, what we can do. Are our policymakers thinking that the ultimate goal of education is to form happy citizens, and to do that, probably connecting them to art, to humanities, is much more a better strategy than not keeping in mind these kind of disciplines. What would you say, Provost Hexel?
I'll try to be very brief because I sort of metaphorically have the microphone so often. But to that question and some of the other ones, and Joe, also to yours, at the risk of opening up a very, very awkward and large can of worms, I think that one cannot ignore some economic and social shifts that have taken place over the period of time, certainly of higher education in the 20th and 21st centuries, but much longer. If I might start from the Roman origin of liberal arts, it starts in a very, very, a place that we would find very uncomfortable. The liberal arts were the things that the liberales, the free citizens, could do because they didn't have to work. And in the early part of the 20th century, and maybe well into the third quarter, the percentage of students getting a BA were small. It still was a relatively privileged audience. And then, as we heard in terms of the flattening of the world, there was certainly in Western Europe and in England and America an opportunity for students who had that polishing simply to step into a whole range of jobs without a lot of competition. Well, in many ways that are very, very good, the world has changed. Now, I don't think that that means that the humanities don't have value. As I tried to show, some of the elements of education are sources of questioning, of sources even of what would be the best way of resistance to whatever the mechanisms of power are. So I think that there's a lot of reason to, even in times when the opportunities to education have changed, and of course people need to prepare for careers, the people who get BAs do have to go to work. They're not the ones who will just manage their estates in Italy, as the Roman citizens may have done. But we have to find ways to tap into all of those pathways of a liberal arts education, of reading the humanities and studying them, that will empower people in whatever their situation is, because I think it really will lead to greater growth and greater justice and greater democracy.
Mario Biagioli, STS and School of Law. So I have a question for Dean Ladusaw. I liked the image that you gave us of these scholars of Mayan language who kept going for 40 years. And people probably, many people thought they were crazy, and then eventually they had their 15 minutes of fame as a result of anxieties about the end of the world. So I thought that that was actually interesting in terms of, so it seems like you were suggesting, rather than saying, look, whatever we do in the humanities, it's really, we don't do it for a purpose, it's just beautiful in and of itself. You're simply saying, look, it may become relevant, right? And which justifies the fact that it may not. You need to support, all. So, that kind of discourse, I think it's quite interesting. And it kind of also dovetails, it could be connected to, think about the new entrepreneurs, or at least the popular discourse about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, right? You need to fail. The worst thing that you can do is to basically go and work for Hewlett-Packard and spend your life there. You need to float a couple of companies, they fail, and then, because it means that you are trying. Okay. So the question is this: could this be the base for a critique of canon? Because of canon. Okay, so suppose I'm talking about, say, Italian studies. Okay, because I was tortured in high school, 5 years of Dante. Okay, so I'm still recovering. So Dante is still crucial to Italian studies. Okay, so you have a field that a lot of people. So if the 15 minutes of fame happens, that suddenly Dante is relevant for something, you have an entire field who's going to try to make a bridge and become relevant. So that doesn't look like a good business model. Right? So wouldn't it make sense instead to diversify? That is, people produce a book, a very important book, super, very well researched, and then force them to change. Like the next book has to be about something profoundly different. Change country, change century. So basically, diversify and push people for their own good to have a better chance at the 15 minutes of fame.
That's remarkable. I'll just say briefly, one of the things I wanted to try to do that I don't think I succeeded in completely was to pull further apart our reasoning and anxieties around why the scholars do what they do and why what we teach to you. Because we're in danger of thinking those things sort of line up. That so much comes out of that lining up, right? So on the scholar side, well, many of my colleagues, kind of the place we have, they say, I need to teach because my students teach me my discipline, right? I know the answers to all these questions. It's when the students come in and they say, why? That suddenly I start learning again. I feel like I'm part of a community of learning. So there's something very true about the constant destruction and reinterpretation that is good on the scholarly side. On the other hand, part of what I think the classical expectation of this citizenship training has more to do with canonization than we should allow in research, actually, because it's that idea that that there are certain questions that you need to give to people over and over again, and it's chewing on those questions, not rushing for an answer, chewing on the questions. That's the thing you should do over and over again. So I think the answer in the two domains are potentially different. Last question, Carol?
Okay, I'm going to give it to the scientist. That's what humanists do. Multiple voices.
So my name is Rick Grossberg. I'm a professor of evolutionary biology and ecology, Cowell College, 1976.
Thought that name sounded good, okay.
And my question is really at those of you who are deans and leaders of this institution and other institutions in the humanities. And what kind of statement do you think it makes about the status of a liberal arts university that there's not a natural scientist on your panel, that on your council of advisors, they're all humanists and artists? That was deliberately provocative. Because I went to Cowell in '76.
I'll provoke you back. Let my friend who's the real humanist here. I'm a linguist. I often say this to the parents. I have taught the same thing in 4 different universities. They have satisfied humanities requirements. They have satisfied social sciences requirements. They have satisfied math requirements. Right? It's not me who's the problem, right? It's the categorization system that's the problem. But I think that the technical reason for my particular board of advisors, I collect them slowly, but I certainly think that it's important for the people who I have on my board to be interested in supporting the transformative teaching of liberal arts. That's why they all ended up as people with humanities degrees, but doing very different things.
But if you asked me to do it,
yeah.
I would accept with honor.
Would you do it?
We can talk about it.
I want to get to you before the provost of Cal gets to you.
Ralph, do you want to?
I've been on plenty of these panels with people from the sciences, and you can sort them in many different ways. But in fact, I think that this is a crucial moment, and some of my colleagues here today have made a similar point. This is a crucial moment for us to form alliances with the sciences, and one of the reasons is because during the culture wars, the scientists got to sit back and kind of laugh while we were all being accused of, being crazy. But now, in fact, the science is under assault, both from those who challenge the scientific method, empiricism, rationality, evidence, etc., but also because of this demand for the utilitarian, practical application of everything. And we see this even, there was an article just a couple of days ago about the latest, budget in Congress for science that should, choose disciplines that have an immediate social value. Now, that was actually directed at the political scientists more than some of the other scientists, but nonetheless, I think that this is exactly the moment when all of us have to be making the claim for, on the one hand, the immense importance and practical value of what we do, but on the other hand, of the need to just understand, the creation of new knowledge, of discovery, without understanding what its immediate impact is, as we've been saying today. So I certainly agree with the import of what you're saying.
Margie?
Could I just add to that, that it seems to me that one of the issues, and this may go back to Joe Kiskis's question too, about how did we get here? We're in a country that has a race to the top for its secondary school children after the very laudably named act, No Child Left Behind. It seems to me when I read the rationale for the Common Core state standards, which have been implemented extremely quickly, in some cases they were implemented before they had actually been published as a document, that there's a sense of panic here that has to do with I would say a qualitative change in the time, in temporality, that is, the parents are feeling this, that somehow or other if their child isn't sure now what she or he is going to be able to do, that it will never happen. And I don't know quite how to analyze this except to say it's what Marx predicts as part of late capitalism. And it really does seem to me it's a collective myth that somehow or other many of us are buying into, and even in the sense that this is a crisis, since part of what we've said is that these crises about the values of the disciplines have gone on plus ça change, even as really new things are coming up. And to Mario's question, I would say diversify, but cui bono, who is going to benefit from this? Is this going to be the scholar who will benefit from writing a new book on a new topic? What the university and the liberal arts education provides for mass education now, that it used to provide only for a very few, is leisure. A little bit of time when you don't have to say exactly how it's going to turn out and what its profit is going to be in terms that can be measured immediately because they translate into some kind of salary. And it seems to me I'm not seeing that even in the Common Core state standards, that far from promoting questioning, it keeps talking about benchmarks, international benchmarks that our children have to somehow or other meet, but at the same time, it's not actually doing anything to give them any training in being able to ask questions, which involves being able to fail and to have wrong answers and to go off on a different path. So
I think this anxiety about time doesn't start with freshmen. I'm the father of a sophomore in high school, and he's decided that because he's gotten into the madrigal group and the symphony and he wants to take music theory, that he's going to take 3 hours of music next year. And part of me is thrilled. And the other part of me says, well, is this going to screw him up for getting into college? And I'm going to just sit on that anxiety and let him do what where his interests lead him.
Ralph, do you want to have the last word?
Sounds like boccaccio.
Well, I think there are some seeds, as Rick suggests, for a number of future provost forums, and I think it would be really interesting to get an interdisciplinary group debating some of these questions. And but I'd like to say thank you to Ralph and the organizers of the Provost Forum for allowing this very interesting session to take place. Special thanks to David and Bill for traveling to UC Davis, to Margie and Chris for representing our faculty in such a distinguished way. So thank you all for coming, and join us for a reception.